Hello, welcome everybody. So glad to have you here for our Knowledge Bites, the next in the series on accessibility upgrades in community projects. So Knowledge Bites are part of the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which my colleague Meg Staloff, who's here today recording for us, manages. And that project is simply meant to expand capacity across Southern Vermont for community projects, provide technical assistance. And this is one of the ways that we do that by putting on webinars. So we have a whole library of things that you can find at brattleborodevelopment.com/SVEP. And the SVEP program is funded in part by USDA RCDI, a Rural Community Development Initiative. So that's what all those logos at the bottom of my screen are. So as we're gathering, if you could just type in the chat, what are some of the projects that you're working on or thinking about working on, so that Caitlin and Peter have an idea. I'm just going to read a couple of those so that folks watching the recording later can get a sense. We've got library projects across the state, an office building, the Bellows Falls Diner, Putney Community Center, Guilford Library, South Newfane Schoolhouse Community Center, another library. Yeah, libraries are having some great representation today. So feel free to keep on popping those in the chat. It's great for you all to see who's working on things too across the state that you might want to connect with. But with that, we'll just go ahead and ask Peter to go ahead and get us started so we can make sure to have plenty of time for questions at the end. And I will say we'll do questions at the end, but we've got a lot to cover in the presentation. So if you can hold your questions till the end, that'd be great. All right, Peter, go ahead.
Peter, you're just, I muted everyone, so you just need to unmute yourself.
All right, that's better.
There you go. Now we have you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me here. Happy to be here along with Caitlin. So this is a brief overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Let's go to the next slide. And what is the ADA? Next slide. So basically the ADA is people with disabilities, civil rights protections. It's actually a civil rights law. So you can't, the same way you can't discriminate against individuals on the basis of race, sex, national origin, religion, etc. So it gives the equal opportunity, and I want to emphasize opportunity. It's not just about physical access. Next slide.
Oh, here we go.
So what is a disability? Sorry, I thought I took these, just clicked through these. I thought I took all the animation out, but I apparently didn't. Sorry. So a disability is a condition caused by accident, trauma, genetics, disease. It can be any number of things. It can limit a person's mobility, hearing, vision, speech, mental function, but it's much broader than that. Breathing is, if you have trouble breathing, that's covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you have a neurological problem going on in your system, so bodily functions, bodily systems, all of those things are covered under the ADA. Next. So there's 4 titles, and we're going to focus on Title 3, but there's Title 1 is employment, and that would apply to any of you if you are employing people with disabilities. And certainly let me know if we need to do a session on that. Happy to do that. Title 2 may apply to some of you if these libraries or other buildings or services are part of government, public services. That's all under Title 2. And then public accommodations, restaurants, public libraries that are, nonprofits, any nonprofit organizations, all of those kinds of things. Any business basically is under Title 3. Telecommunications is under Title 4, and there's a bunch of odds and ends that are covered under miscellaneous Title 5. Next slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just employment is Title 1, and you have to make reasonable accommodations for people you're employing. if they need that in order to be employed. One thing I'll mention here, if you want to be more open and inclusive to people with disabilities, when you put out a job ad, put on the bottom of that job ad that we will provide reasonable accommodations in the interview process or in the application process, so that people know that they can make that request. Next slide. So I mentioned Title II is covered under all public entities, state, local governments. We'll just go to Title III. And this is really where you all are, most of you fall in. Some of you may, as I said, fall into Title II, but this is restaurants, theaters, retail stores, all of those kinds of things, banks, all of that stuff is covered under Title III. And I don't think I have slides for Title IV and V. I don't. Oh, yeah, Title IV is telecommunications. So if you've communicated with people who are deaf, the relay services, those are all part of Title IV under the ADA. Next slide. And miscellaneous covers all these other different odds and ends. So why should you do this? Well, obviously it's the law, but it really is broader than that. You should really, because this provides equal opportunity for everybody, and it's going to increase your customer base. I mean, when the ADA first came about over 30 years ago, you know, some business owners would say, well, you know, nobody with disabilities comes in here. Well, that's because you have 5 steps to get in the building. No wonder they don't come in. So, you know, you remove those barriers, people can get in. Next slide. And again, this just reiterates us that the Americans with Disability Act requires us an equal opportunity for persons with disabilities in employment, government programs, telecommunication, transportation, all kinds of public accommodations. And so whether it's a downtown area, whatever, to the greatest extent possible. And Caitlin will talk about the historic property stuff, so I'll leave that to her. Business and nonprofit organizations that serve the public must remove architectural barriers when it's readily achievable, and that's actually the language in the law. When it's easily accomplished and doesn't have a lot of expense, the decision about what's readily achievable is made when you consider, you know, the size and type of the organization. If you're a small mom and pop store and you don't have a lot of resources, that's going to be a factor. If you're a big, you know, multinational corporation, you've got lots of resources. So the expectations would be very different. And the barrier removal also, make a point here on this last thing is, and this is very true for Title II public government agencies, but it's really important for public accommodations. You've had over 30 years to plan for making things accessible, even if they weren't readily achievable 30 years ago. If you planned for them and set out to do them, they could very much be readily achievable by now or before now. So you need to pay attention to what may be possible in the future. So equal access to buildings, goods, services, and activities, all of those things, not just physical access to buildings. Next. We can go by this. This just gives you some specs on that. And so here's some really simple kinds of things that people can do to achieve access. One step, pretty easy to solve. Next slide. Just some other ways to provide better access for people coming into stores. In the bottom, where there's people at a restaurant, the waiter is reading the menu to the person who's blind and can't see it. So that's a way that you can access activities that you need, other than, you know, the commercial making space available between aisles and you know, retail spaces. Next slide. Again, here's just another way that people can have better access. You will see a lot of times in grocery stores, some of the checkout aisles are marked as access aisles because they're wider. The counters may be a little bit lower. Those are all helpful things. Next. Again, more details on this in the resources. This is just what you need to know to make these bathrooms accessible. Next. And just some language if you're dealing with people with disabilities. So it's always person first, not the disability. Next. So person who uses a wheelchair, person with a cognitive disability, and so on. Person who is deaf, person with a visual disability. Actually, a lot of people now prefer person with low vision, but all those are fine. You will find occasionally a few people who really identify as a disabled person, so they're going to put disabled first, but they'll let you know that's not anything for you to be concerned. So start with person first language. Next. So do offer assistance. Speak directly to the person with a disability, even if they're using an interpreter. If somebody's using a wheelchair and it's possible for you to either sit in a chair next to them or squat down so you're at eye level with them, those are all very helpful kinds of ways to do that. And then again, just reiterating that it's not just about physical access. Next slide. So now Caitlin can jump in and then I'll come back in the end.
All right. Thank you, Peter. All right, Caitlin, you're up.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Peter, for setting that up. I love how you sort of talked about the really broad ideas. I'm going to drill down pretty specifically on historic preservation as historic buildings and accessibility, and give a couple of case studies of some recent projects that I've worked on. So we can go ahead and go forward, Rachel. I'm not seeing it move forward. I don't know if you did. It's still stuck on just Division for Historic Preservation.
Let's see. I'm seeing, what does the ADA say?
Okay, well, I'm just gonna hope other people are seeing
Here, let me just reshare.
No.
Let's see. Try this one.
Yes, okay, now I see it. Thank you. It's just a little disconcerting not to see this slide on the screen. All right, so I do want to just highlight some language from the ADA as it relates to historic buildings. As many of you probably know, the ADA does provide an exemption for qualified historic properties, which states that historic buildings may be eligible to meet alternative minimum standards if full compliance would threaten or destroy the resource's historic significance. To be considered historic, a building must be either listed in the National Register of Historic Places or formally determined eligible for listing. So if you're unsure about the status of your building, you can always reach out to our office and we can let you know if it's listed or not. And if it's not, we can also complete formal determinations of eligibility. Next slide. As part of the consultation process, we want to be involved as early as possible to work through any potential issues. It's always so much easier to make changes to a project if needed during the conceptual stage. And we're also happy to meet and walk through buildings on site to discuss options. Our goal is always to find compromises that meet the spirit of the ADA while protecting the building's most important historic features. Next slide. I do want to note that there's no historic, even though there is this historic exemption, there's not a blanket provision that then says you don't need to do anything. And there's also no grandfather rule. Exemptions apply only to historic buildings, not new additions or new construction. And even if a historic building qualifies, it still needs to be made accessible to the maximum extent feasible. A building that is empty or underutilized because it doesn't accommodate the needs of everyone doesn't serve the cause of historic preservation. We want to see historic buildings used. And if this requires modifications, we're open to that. We just want to make sure that those changes are made thoughtfully and in consideration of what makes the building historic in the first place. Next slide. So these are my tips for thinking about design solutions in historic buildings. Most important, each project, like any person, is unique. There are no cookie cutter solutions when it comes to historic buildings. So being open to creative solutions is important for success, rather than coming at the project with a preconceived idea of what must happen. In any project involving a historic building, the first step is to identify the character-defining features of that building. Sometimes they may be obvious, but other times they may not be. It's also important to consider how a building was used historically, not just how it looks. And you should consider changes over time and what past changes may have their own importance. Once you know what's important to preserve, you can look at design solutions to avoid changes to those features or minimize changes to those features. Reversibility is also a great thing to consider. We can't know what the future holds and what uses might require different solutions. So making changes reversible is an important preservation technique. And finally, it probably goes without saying, but details matter. I've seen plenty of conceptual designs where the early direction of a project is good, but then some final material choice or design detail really derails what would otherwise be a sensitive alteration. And also, last but not least, please always feel free to reach out to our office. We're happy to get you headed down the right direction. Next slide. So I wanted to go through a few case studies of recent projects that I think were successful in making sensitive alterations to address ADA deficiencies. This is a recently completed federal tax credit project, the East Calais General Store. It's an anchor of the East Calais National Register Historic District. And as one of the most important and prominent buildings in the village, its preservation is important not just for the building itself, but the entire district. Next slide. So the pre-existing main entry was up a set of steps onto the two-story porch, which had a pretty significant elevation change. And we really struggled with where to put the ramp. There wasn't room on either side of the building because of a road and the tight lot lines. And there's actually no access at all into the building from the rear. So there really was no other option but the front. At the same time, we were looking at this project, we were also asked to consider demolition of the existing garage addition, which is bumping out on the left of that picture at the top there. It was constructed sometime after 1920, so not original to the building, but still potentially historic due to its age. We looked at it pretty closely and determined that due to previous alterations, it did not retain its historic integrity, and so it could come down. And this gave us an opportunity to consider this area as a location for the new ramp. Next slide. We also looked at the possibility of reinstating these carriage bay doors that were a historic feature of the building that had been lost when the garage addition was added. So basically this part of the building, this L, had seen a lot of change over time. And because of that, it seemed like a good opportunity to make further changes to make the building accessible while also reinstating a historic feature that had been lost. So the design team considered multiple alternatives, at least 3 or 4, before arriving at the final design solution with the new ramp tucked in the corner of the main block in the L. This did mean creating a new doorway and then closing in an existing doorway, but it allowed that ramp to be tucked in so it didn't obscure the recreated historic carriage bay doors, but let it be a full straight run and fully covered. I think there were also some really thoughtful details to the final design. Initially, a wooden railing had been proposed, but we agreed that a metal railing was going to be lighter and more transparent while still fully meeting the code requirements. The side of the ramp was also finished with horizontal wood planking that created kind of a low wall. That further reduced the amount of railing that was required and sort of hid the sloping ramp from view. You'll also notice in the final picture that they got rid of that staircase going straight out. It further simplified the design, minimized the amount of railing, and actually maximized their parking. So win-win all around. Overall, I think this design was really successful. Yes, the ramp is on the front of a historic building, but it's on a secondary addition, which had already been heavily modified, and it was completed with some thoughtful details to help it blend in. Okay, next slide. So we have a lot of libraries, which is great. Let's talk about libraries and vertical access and additions. We have so many of these wonderful little jewel box libraries in Vermont. This is an example, the South Royalton Library. Unfortunately, these buildings are usually not accessible and can be hard to modify given their small footprint and sometimes very small constrained lots. So a lot of times an addition is really the best option. This is one we worked on a few years ago, though the process, I think, from initial conception to actual construction took about 20 years. It involved buying a piece of neighboring property to give space for an addition and moving the town offices, which had been in the lower level of the building, to a completely different building. Next slide. So we knew from the start an addition was the solution. This building was really too small to put an elevator inside of it. It would have rendered the building unusable. So this was the initial design concept. And a few things to note from here. We agreed that the location of the proposed addition was appropriate. It's off the back of the building, facing the existing side street. But we felt the massing was too big and sort of overwhelmed the historic building. Next slide. So we work with the project team to refine the design, and this is the drawing of the final design as well as the floor plan. I like how this design allowed for not only providing an elevator between levels, but also a new code compliant staircase. So people that may not need to use an elevator, but might still have mobility issues, have a safe, compliant staircase to use. And in this case, the existing staircase in the building was not an important design feature or historic feature, so its removal was not an issue. And they also tucked in accessible restrooms on both levels of the library, which is another really great element of the project. The elevation itself, you can see they did a good job of mimicking some of the colonial revival details of the building without matching it. So it is still that brick cladding and concrete, but sort of simplified. They don't have the corner coins in the building, but they still reference those colonial revival details with the 6/6 windows and the entry portico. And I love that this new entryway is welcoming, but it still doesn't compete with the original historic portico. So again, a real win-win project. Next slide. And the final case study is actually a project that hasn't begun yet, but I wanted to highlight it because I think the team that's working on this is doing such a wonderful job of thinking really holistically about access. This is the Vergennes Opera House, which is also the city's municipal offices. So it's a really historic building, and it is vital that it be accessible to serve all its residents. The current accessible entrances are really far from ideal. To access the first floor, people have to traverse the alley in between the building and the neighboring church. It's sort of dirty, dingy. You're sort of like, am I even supposed to come up this way? So not the best experience for people who need that accessible entrance. To get to the auditorium level, it's even more ridiculous. You have to go up around the other side of the building, up a steep gravel driveway, and then walk across this little bridge into a door that goes through what used to be a window into the second floor. So not ideal. When the project team started to look at this project, they had the goal of not only making the two levels more accessible, but providing more welcoming experience for people that were using the accessible entrance. And also really excitingly, they're working to make not just the main levels of the building accessible, but also the stage and the green rooms. So not only can people attend performances in the auditorium space, but they could be part of the performance. They could be up on the stage or backstage helping with hair and makeup. Next slide. So since this building is on a very small lot, there's not a lot of places to put an accessible entrance, and they are still looking at the alleyway. They're looking at a small addition that will have a lift in it, so it provides vertical access to both of the main levels of the building. And then separately within the building, another lift that will provide access to the stage and the green room areas. Another thing that's really exciting about this, and you can go to the next slide, is how they're thinking, oh shoot, actually go back. That didn't make it in. Well, I'll just talk about it. So the other thing that they're doing that I think is really great is making that alley more welcoming. So they're thinking about a lot of ways to make that experience with greenery, with seating, with landscape features, to make it seem like this is the place you go to enter the building. And really, really exciting is that they are also thinking about using that public space alongside the neighboring church to see if they can come up with a way to help address some of the deficiencies in terms of accessibility for the church as well. It's shared public space, and so even though the church may not have the capacity to do that project now, the way that they're thinking about it holistically, it's not just accessibility for this one building, but really for the whole community. And I think that that community-wide kind of effort and not thinking about accessibility and isolation is really exciting. So finally, I do have a couple of slides on resources. If people are interested in more information, the National Park Service puts out these preservation briefs, and they have multiple briefs available online that talk about making historic properties accessible and provide some really great additional examples. And next slide. And I also do want to mention that there is public funding available to help with these projects. Unfortunately, I don't have time today to delve into this. It could be its own session, I'm sure, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of the programs. There are others, but I always want to just encourage people to feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help point people towards the opportunities that they're eligible for. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Peter.
Thanks, Caitlin. Let me pull Peter's slide back up. All right, so now where do you start? Let's get you unmuted there, Peter. All right.
So
good.
I just want to say a special thank you to Caitlin for including the East Calais store in your presentation. As a resident of East Calais, we're really excited that the store is open again. It's been wonderful. It's been really great. So I'm glad you used that as one of your case studies.
Are you seeing your presentation, Peter?
No, I am not. I'm seeing
My
questions.
goodness. All right, I'm gonna try again. How about now? No.
No, not yet.
Stop. I'm gonna stop
There,
the share.
no.
Oh.
Yeah.
Man, even when you practice, you still end up with technical difficulties. All right,
Oh yeah.
here we go.
There we go. Okay. So where do you start with all this? You know, it can be daunting. And it's just important to remember that, you know, achieving access is an ongoing process. It's not something you do once and you're done. That just isn't going to happen. But also the way to think about this, which is really important, is that the ADA also looks at this too. And I included a resource of the ADA checklist, which is a great resource, and it's divided into these priorities. And so the first one is parking and an accessible approach and the entrance. I mean, if you can't get in, there's little point in doing anything else. And then once you're in, how do you access goods and services? Then the next priority is toilet rooms. And then finally, other situations might be things like water fountains or public telephones, that kind of thing. So that's really the order you need to think of these things as you're starting to make something accessible. You know, I've seen places that, for some reason bathrooms jump out at people, and so they work really hard to make the bathroom accessible, but you still can't get into the building. So sometimes it's counterproductive. Next slide. So places of public accommodation are not required to do a self-examination transition plan under Title II. Local state entities, government organizations are. There's all kinds of requirements, but depending on how many staff you have, employees you have, that kind of thing. But it's really a good thing to do. And what a self-evaluation is kind of what it is. It's you go through and you evaluate what we need to do to improve access, to make this more welcoming, not only physical access, but to achieve program access. And I apologize, I missed taking out, this was from a Title II slide. You don't need to worry about if more than 50 employees. That's for Title II people. And I'll go a little bit into the checklist, but there's the link to the checklist. Next slide. So this is just a page out of this checklist. If you print it out, it's a big document, but it is good to print it out in sections. And it's one of the reasons it looks really daunting is it's got a lot of really good detail in it, so you really know what you're doing. So that if you've got a person, either in a building or coming in a building, you can look at this and see very clearly, do these dimensions work? Are they making it so that this person can actually get in? And I mean, there's lots more to this, but I just wanted to give people a sense of what a page of this looked like, because it initially can look overwhelming, but it can be really useful if you're just sort of methodical about your approach. Next slide. So a transition plan is a document that you've gone through and you've evaluated, you've done a self-evaluation, and you say, oh, well, we should change these different things to improve access. Should detail how you're doing it, give a timeline. You may recognize that, oh, well, we can do a parking space, make sure the path of travel is good on the entrance. That's not too difficult. There's only one step. Oh, we really don't have room for an accessible bathroom. What are we going to do there? So on your transition plan, you say, okay, we'll plan on that now. So we budget money for it. So in 2 years, we'll have enough money to go through the process of making this bathroom accessible. It's just an example of how you want to do that. Some things you can do quickly, some things are going to take longer. Putting in a lift in an existing building, they're very expensive, may take quite a while. But one of the things that's really important about this document, there's no ADA police running around and looking at things and making sure that you've done it right. The ADA police are the people who are coming to your building. And so if somebody's coming to the building and complains because something's not accessible, this document is your good faith effort that you're working on it. We know we didn't do this. We simply couldn't do this at this time due to the expense, but we have it planned for a year from now. So those kinds of things are important. So that's, even though it's not required under the ADA for places of public accommodation, we recommend that they do it. Next slide. So resources, I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and stuff. So that's our website address, the access board. Again, I put the link for the ADA checklist. Ask Jan is really more for if you have an employee who needs an accommodation. They have some really excellent information about how to make reasonable accommodations that don't always cost very much money. So that's something really important. And VCIL also, as Caitlin offered, we will do on-site consultations. We can, to a certain extent, help you with a self-evaluation, depending on how involved it would be. I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, the town of Bennington had a transition plan that they did in 1995. So it certainly needed to be updated. So we did go through and help them update that plan. It were 5 different city buildings that we looked at. So for these projects, we're looking at 1 or 2 buildings. It's going to be a little bit easier project, but we can certainly help if you need some assistance in doing the self-evaluation and giving some technical assistance in terms of putting a transition plan together. We can answer ADA questions by just giving us a call. Across the country, the little map there shows there are ADA technical assistance centers across the country. The one in Region 1 and ours is in Boston, and we have a grant from them to provide ADA technical assistance in Vermont. And just as a little bit of trivia, the most common question across the country for all 10 centers is about service animals. And that's a whole other presentation, but that may be a surprise to some people, maybe not. So I think we're open for questions at this point.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Peter and Caitlin. So we had a question in the chat that we'll kick it off with, and feel free to put a question in the chat or raise your hand. But Caitlin, Maya was asking if you could speak a little more to where to find funding.
Yeah, like I said, that could be an entire separate webinar in this series, because there are a lot of programs out there, but a lot of it depends on who the applicant is, because some funding sources are available for municipalities. There are some funding sources that are available to nonprofit organizations, and there are even a few funding options that are available for private entities. So one of the first questions I ask when I'm talking to people is, who is the applicant? Are you a nonprofit? Are you a municipality? Like, who are you? And from there, we can talk about what funding options might be available. The two that I had up on the slide, the Vermont Community Development Program, that's federal funding through HUD. That is specifically for municipalities, although it can be sub-granted from a municipality to another entity. The other one I had up there was the Arts Council. Vermont Arts Council has this great program called the Cultural Facilities Grant Program. So this is state funding, and it is specifically for nonprofit organizations and municipalities to serve buildings that provide cultural programming. So it could be a library, it could be a theater, it could be a historical society. The definition of cultural programming is pretty broad, anything from theater to music to arts and culture. But there does have to be some kind of cultural programming happening in the building to qualify for that grant source. Some of the examples that I showed, the first one, that East Calais General Store, that is a business, but it's also a nonprofit entity. So they were able to take advantage of a number of different programs, including historic tax credit program, which I administer both federal and state programs. So those are both programs that can be accessed by nonprofit organizations or businesses. And they provide tax credits to offset the cost of making improvements. And we do have credits specifically through our state program for meeting code requirements. And that includes, of course, meeting ADA code requirements. And then the Royalton Library Project, again, I believe it used a suite of different funding sources, including the Community Development Block Grant and funding from the Arts Council, among other things, to complete their project. So I could go on and on, but I think the thing I really hope people take away is that there are folks in our office that are really happy to talk with people about a specific project and then help guide them to the right funding opportunities, so you're not spinning your wheels, because it can get a little overwhelming otherwise, I think.
And Tom is highlighting in the chat that the MERP mini grants. So MERP is a funding source for municipalities from the state, and they give out mini grants, which are $4,000. as part of a larger program that you may or may not know about, feel free to ask us about that afterwards. But that those $4,000 mini grants can be used for hiring a consultant for ADA compliance and readiness. Peter, did you have any other thoughts about funding?
Kayla's really covered it well. I don't really have any additional things. I mean, obviously you can do fundraising, which people do that kind of work as well. But this is why a transition plan is also important, because it takes time to do those things. So if you have a document that gives a timeline, who's responsible for it, and those kinds of things, it really helps. Not only if somebody complains, but just to keep your own self organized and on track.
Thank you. And Pam, I know you're familiar with the Royalton Library project. You mentioned that was a great thing for your family, and you've worked with Peter a little bit on the South Londonderry Free Library. I see you're on the screen. Do you have a question you want to ask?
No, I just wanted to comment that, for the community of South Royalton, with the elevator and accessibility, it's an amazing process, and they're able to increase community programming, which I'm seeing a lot of libraries are doing now. People are, out of power, they're out of Wi-Fi, and accessibility and community usage is so important, and accessibility. So, yeah, funding is where I'm going now. So
Good luck. Yeah, and
Thank
we have
you.
a question in the chat too. What if your facility is not on the National Historic Register? And this, I can take this one, Caitlin. It just needs to be eligible. It doesn't need to be listed. So Caitlin and other folks at the State Division for Historic Preservation can help you make that determination. But probably, I mean, our community buildings in Vermont tend to be historic, so you're probably going to be okay if there haven't been too many changes. Other questions? Feel free to pop on the screen or type something in the chat.
Rachel, I'll jump in. You mentioned in an email that somebody had either posed a question or somehow it came up that there was a library that was only 800 square feet. How do you make it accessible?
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to actually address that question. In order to answer it more fully, I would need to know things like, is it part of state government? Is it a nonprofit? Are those 800 square feet inside another building? All of those things.
Do we have the Guilford Library in the house? I thought I saw somebody. I believe it is freestanding and town owned, but if somebody on the call can offer clarification, go for it.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, Judith says yes.
Okay. So in this kind of a situation, the best thing to do is to make sure you have program access, even if you don't have physical access. So make sure people who want library services, checking out books, they have an alternative way to do that, whether you do it by mail, whether there's a way that they can park and drive up and they can either online or by phone, they can say, I want these books, and somebody meets them in the parking lot, and they can transact the business that way. So there, none of those necessarily are ideal, especially maybe in the winter time, but those are things to think about in terms of what you can do to make sure everybody can access things. Creating more material that's digital, so people, if they have internet access, can access materials that way. Having audio stuff that is easier to you can either download it, or it's just easier to distribute through the mail, aside from books. So again, it's partly just kind of trying to get creative and think about ways that you can do that. And in all of these things, it's really important to make every effort to invite people with disabilities in the beginning to these planning sessions. This is what we want to do. there's no better way if you're trying to figure out how a person with a wheelchair is going to get into a building that's not accessible right now, is to have a person in a wheelchair take a look. They may not be an architectural expert or anything, but they all have a pretty good idea because they've run into those barriers numerous times. And then, by including the person with a disability, whether it's somebody who's blind, whether it's somebody who's deaf, that's creating a community that's welcoming to everybody in the community. So those are very important things that you want to really think about in terms of when you start your planning to do it early to get input from people in the community who have disabilities.
Thanks, Peter. And I love that emphasis on program access. Like that's really, the whole point of getting people in the buildings is for program access. So if there's not a way right now to get them in the building, there's a way to make the program accessible. Other ways, that's really smart. Well, we are at our time, so feel free to, if you have other questions, we'll send out Caitlin and Peter's contact information with the recording. You can reach out to Meg and myself as well. Our next Knowledge Bites webinar is in January 18th, and it's on working with a project manager for community projects. So if you as a volunteer or sole staff member, for instance, are feeling really overwhelmed by a project that is quickly getting too big to handle, you might want to think about how you can build in a project manager to your funding stack, which I know sounds a little intimidating, but we're going to talk about that and talk about the benefits, pros and cons, and how you'd go about it. So thank you all for being here. Caitlin and Peter, thank you so much. This was really helpful. And we'll see you all hopefully in January.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.